Good afternoon, everyone. We'll be starting shortly as people begin joining us. Good afternoon and welcome to Boost CYAC's webinar series. This series focuses on the national guidelines for Canadian child advocacy centers and child and youth advocacy centers. Before we begin our session, there are a few quick housekeeping points. For participants listening in French, click on Interpretation and choose French. The presentation in both English and French, as well as the presenters' bios, can be downloaded directly from the chat. There will be a Q&A during the last 10 minutes of the webinar. Please type your question in the Q&A tab. You can submit your questions at any time. If you are watching this webinar in a group, please enter the number of participants in the group in the chat. It is now my pleasure to turn things over to our facilitators, Daniel Garfinkel and Carrie Sanders.
Thanks so much, Pearl. It is a real honor, and I'm humbled to be joining you for today's presentation from the traditional and unceded territories of the Coast Salish peoples, including the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh nations. I'll hand it over to Carrie.
Thank you, Daniel. And my name is Carrie Sanders, and I would also like to express it as an honor to be joining regarding the Child, Youth, and Advocacy Centers for Canada. And I very much would like to acknowledge the Treaty 7 territory that I am joining you from, which is the traditional and ancestral territory of the Blackfoot Confederacy. And that includes the Kainai, the Piikani, and the Siksika, as well as the Tsuut'ina and Stoney Nakoda First Nations, as well as the Métis. Thank you.
And of course, it is a real pleasure to be presenting today with Carrie. So Carrie and I worked closely together for a number of years in Calgary, which is now the Luna Center, formerly the Calgary and Area CAC, and then prior to that, the Sheldon Kennedy CAC. And Carrie and I were working together at a time when the case review process was being developed and implemented at the center. And we'll be talking about some of our experiences from that stage. All right. In terms of what we have planned for the hour, we're going to start by talking about what the case reviews look like, their purpose, their process, their structure, the how and the what of case reviews. And then we'll go into the some important considerations when a case review process is being developed. And then finally, Carrie and I will present 2 illustrations of case reviews. So regarding, what is a case review, the national guidelines, oh, sorry, Carrie, you're going too fast for me. Thanks. I can't keep up. All right, so in terms of what is a case review, the national guidelines for child and youth advocacy centers, the most recent publication of these just in 2021 included this statement of what a case review is. I'll read it. A case review is a trauma-informed, collaborative, formal process to discuss elements of the case, including the investigation, addressing any safety or risk issues for the child and the family, making a plan for ongoing support, and preparing for any criminal justice process as necessary. All right, I'm ready for the next slide, Carrie. Excellent. Regarding the what and the how of these case review, what the objectives are. So case reviews are a regularly scheduled formal opportunity for the multidisciplinary team members to come together to have a focused and structured discussion about a specific case. These case reviews are not meant to take the place of the regular, ongoing, informal discussions that will happen amongst the multidisciplinary team. As well, those informal discussions are not meant to take the place of a formal case review. So these case reviews are specifically intended for the purpose of providing something that is formal and structured and regularly scheduled. Each discipline on the MDT ideally will participate in the case reviews. There may be a representative from each partner organization or each multidisciplinary team member, and they may also have their supervisors attending. And Carrie will talk in a few moments about some of those considerations regarding who attends. And then in terms of what happens at the CYAC, you have a roundtable of the team members, and each one of them shares their piece. So each discipline contributes their respective case information, their perspective, and their professional expertise. So more specifically, the case review will include a presentation of various aspects of the case. It might start with a brief summary of the allegations about what happened to the child. From there, there'll be a description of the relationship between the offender to the child, as well as to the child's family. Relevant information regarding the child's current circumstances will then be shared and discussed. So this will include the child's current whereabouts, where they're living and with whom, who their primary caregiver is. Any safety concerns will be outlined, as well as any safety plans that have been developed and implemented. There will be discussion of the child's well-being, their physical and medical health, their emotional well-being, any mental health needs, as well as information about their developmental level. All of that will have implications for the way in which support is being provided to the child and their family. From there, there may be discussion about the reaction of the family to the disclosure, as well as to the investigation. Importantly, it should be discussed whether or not the family believes the child's disclosure. There may be other discussions about important cultural considerations, as well as the family's experience with law enforcement, with child protection, any issues of the family experiencing racism, discrimination. All of those things may be relevant to the discussion of a case. And then next, there'll be a review of any decisions or actions or concerns related to the investigation and the provision of medical, mental health, and victim services, as well as any involvement or recommendations for court preparation, court support. There may be a review of the role of the Crown or prosecution in the case at this point, and the involvement of the child in the court proceedings. And then finally, the case review may also include any follow-up on recommendations that have previously been made by the multidisciplinary team regarding the status of those recommendations, any referrals for support for the family, and the family's engagement and follow through with those recommended services. So many of the things that I just listed may be discussed during the case review. Not all of that needs to be discussed. It's what's relevant is going to be the focus. And then each team member is going to have a contribution regarding those various aspects. They may have specific information or expertise to share about those aspects of those pieces of information that I just summarized. Most case reviews are going to have a specific purpose. So for example, the case is brought forward because there is a concern or a problem that needs to be addressed. There's a need for collaboration to come up with a solution that is going to be feasible for all of the partners involved, feasible from an investigative standpoint, from a child protection standpoint, from a service delivery standpoint. And the hope is that this case review will allow for there to be sharing of knowledge, expertise, and experience. So where all relevant information is being communicated, where multiple perspectives are being considered. When that happens, the MDT is able to make informed decisions. And this promotes communication, it promotes collaboration, shared accountability and responsibility that really goes beyond accountability to your own organization or employer. It's bigger than that. Rather, as a collective, the MDT, each person on the MDT has a role to play in ensuring that kids are safe and that they're supported, that their needs are being met, and that the child is at the center of decisions that are being made. I'll go on to that next slide now, Carrie. The case review guidelines do include some information about how centers can meet these guidelines. This is also described in the United States-based National Children's Alliance document on approaches for meeting specific accreditation standards. And some of these can be adopted by Canadian centers. So one is that the CYAC can develop their own written case review procedures that outline the processes and the protocol that's going to be followed for the case reviews, including what cases are selected and how they're selected, and then what happens in the meeting, who attends, the flow. Importantly, the CYAC should designate a specific staff member to coordinate the case reviews and also to facilitate the case reviews. And there should be someone that has experience with facilitating meetings of this kind. And then case reviews might occur for all of the cases at the center. That would likely only be feasible if it's a very small center with a small number of files. That would not be possible for larger centers. For those larger centers, they will instead be selecting specific cases for these case reviews. And these would be cases where there is a particular question or concern that needs to be addressed or resolved by having the MDT come together. All right, I'm going to pass it over to Carrie. Go ahead.
Sorry, I'm getting to the unmute and move the slide at the same time. There we go. Oh, now we've double moved. So as Daniel had commented that we were working at the Calgary, the CAC or CYAC that was in Calgary at the time, called the Luna Center now. And we were working there at the time when part of my role was to develop some of these processes that are more from the either the nonprofit organization or the if you're lucky enough to have a CYAC that has a nonprofit section to kind of support them. And so we certainly learned some things during that time and took some things into consideration. I think it's important to share those today. So some of it was really including all partner organizations in that development and having people's input into that development of what it's going to look like. The documentation that Daniel talked about is really important to create, but to create it in collaboration as a collective, because it is really a significant area where we can work together as an MDT and have the greater strength of all of the different professionals working together to have a better outcome for children. And so having everybody's input helps to have that better outcome, but it also helps to have the buy-in and the understanding of the necessity of these types of case reviews and that collective component. One of the things that we really talked about quite a bit as a child advocacy center at the time was having the commitment from all partner organizations who are participating right from the top down. So, we often find that having frontline workers are all very interested and typically are interested in working collectively together. Sometimes there's some hesitancy or some worry about that, worry about information sharing and what can or can't be shared. But having the commitment to have these occur right from that senior level of management in the development of it really was something that was helpful for us as we were developing it and helps for the continuation of it. When when I talk to other child advocacy centers and child youth and advocacy centers, both in Canada and the United States at the time, many of them were saying that this was one of the more difficult standards or the guidelines to have fulfilled or to have, and not so much the fulfilled, but the commitment of all individuals and the buy-in really from people to participate. And I think sometimes that is about the understanding of the benefits. And so we're going to go through that a little bit more about some of what those benefits are. But we realize that part of it is an ongoing education of new staff that come through the Child Advocacy Center, new leaders that come through within the partner organizations, that continuing to have that education occur, but then also having them have the full knowledge. And if they've been involved right from the very beginning in the development of it, then they have the full knowledge of what this process is and why it is important. The scheduling was something else that we really found was something that needed to happen. Daniel can attest to, I would be at our frontline meetings, we would call them at the time, and it was about kind of the management that was at the Child Advocacy Center working right on the floor, that they would meet regularly. And we would be saying, okay, who's up this month? And we had them scheduled and set times so that there was actually a commitment from those leaders to be present.
I think we had a rotation, Carrie, was that right? So
absolutely,
the rotation
that's correct.
of partners. So it would, each month, it would be a different partner bringing a case forward.
That's right, absolutely. And so having the ability to say, okay, children's services, it's your month today. need to find something that can bring it forward. And for us, that was more about the development process and having the partners kind of start to see and understand the benefits. The scheduling also was really necessary for kind of that set time, but we also had to have, and this was something that we decided as a center, the ability to have spontaneous case reviews. So that, because if there's something that is coming up that is necessary to discuss, or something that is more urgent to be spoken to about, that there was the ability to have it spontaneous within a short period of time, and that there was still the commitment from the leaders and the frontline workers to either be present themselves or to designate somebody from their team that would have the expertise and the knowledge of both their profession, but also the file, to be able to help understand that. So those were all things that we really took into consideration, and were not always easy. They sound easy, and when you kind of put them on a slide, you think, oh, that's all easy stuff. But as many people working within the Child Advocacy Center know, that this is stuff that really needs to be thought through, because it's so many different organizations working together. One of the other things that we really had to talk about and consider when we're developing such a process is about who attends the case review. And this is something that I think that each CYAC, as they're developing, if this is not something that is already occurring, that they'll really need to think through what is necessary for our Child Advocacy Center, and what is going to be the most useful. The standards in the United States and the guidelines within Canada do speak to having all of the MD team members present. And that is something that is really important, to make sure that this isn't a select individuals that are brought forward for something about specific planning, but this is really bringing everybody forward. And then it goes back to some of that commitment, because it sometimes is really looking at, is the time worthy of us being present? Now, we did have times that we would look to say, okay, well, I think that, if this organization is not able to be present, they're invited, they're able to be there, but this is the specific ask or specific discussion today, that they could, on occasion, make the decision or the choice not to be there. We certainly, the Crown is a consideration within Canada. When you're looking at the guidelines within Canada, our Crown partnership is very different than the US, and there is a time when they may be invited and included, but there may be many times that isn't relevant, or even something that they feel that they can participate in. And so that's, certainly a consideration that needs to be discussed within that whole development process. Information sharing is absolutely something that needs to be taken into consideration within each province, because each province has different legislation on that. That will make a difference across Canada about who actually gets to participate or not participate, and may make some decisions for you. In Alberta and several other provinces within Canada, we have what I feel very lucky to have now had the passing of information sharing for the best interests of children. That has made it quite a bit looser to be able to ensure who you feel needs to be present at those can be present, and discussions can occur. There may be some child advocacy centers or child youth and advocacy centers across Canada that may look to have family present at some of these. That has not been the case within the world where I've been working, that it has typically been a professional-based time. And with that information sharing needs to be considered. do consents need to be obtained from family, especially if they are not present? The partnership agreements may also speak to that, so memorandums of understanding. And so that really needs to be looked at within the development time period. Is this something that needs to be taken into consideration? And then looking at whether internal or external partners, and that may look different within different child, youth, and advocacy centers, child and youth advocacy centers. For who is considered an external and who is considered an internal partner. There would be definitely times where perhaps education could be considered an external individual and brought forward or requested to come, because it was going to be something very specific, and definitely within those provinces where information sharing is really looking at the benefits for the best interests of children, that could occur. So things to consider, and these are absolutely things then that need to be discussed when the development of these case reviews occurs, so that every partner has an understanding of when that should or should not occur, and who would be present at them. One of the things I didn't speak to earlier that I just wanted to speak to about the education of the benefits. We think of different types of benefits, and absolutely the benefits to the case are pretty evident. Absolutely having participants be present from every MDT really brings a richer information sharing, often things that can be determined that can make a better case, either for the police or for our crowns, better services that can occur within our mental health world, victim support, all of that. So I think that can be, pretty self-evident that we can have this occur in a better way. Some of the things that aren't often thought about and can have huge impact when shared and educated with our partners is about some of the system benefits, and then also some of the staff benefits. So with the staff participating in a whole collaborative process where they get to hear about the work that occurs with a family that they're involved with, and continuing with other services. So for example, looking at how the police are then seeing how a child is faring with their supports through their mental health therapist, The information that certainly I received when working with individuals, that they felt a much greater satisfaction within the work that they were doing. They felt better hearing about the child that was going to see the therapist in an ongoing basis, and we're doing better. Better than when they maybe did the forensic interview with the child. That creates a much better staff satisfaction. And the research and evidence tells us that compassion satisfaction can increase the resiliency for compassion fatigue. And so, these are all small little benefits that we often don't think of with things such as coming together for a case review. And so educating both your frontline staff and the leadership on the benefits of that can be huge. The system benefits can range from many different areas that aren't thought of. We go into these case reviews thinking, what can we do to better enhance the success for this family, whether it be or this child, whether it be for the police outcome, as I said earlier, or their mental health or children's services safety that is occurring. But looking at how the collaborative work occurs within a child and youth advocacy center can really benefit sometimes how a process occurs. And we're going to later talk about, Daniel and I, a case example that really illustrates that. But discussing these things as a group can highlight areas for training that needs to occur. It can highlight advocacy that maybe the Child Advocacy Center can take on within that community, to make changes not only for that specific child, but perhaps for future children or coming through the center or within the community. So those are all benefits that that sometimes aren't thought of and are really important to be able to share and educate on why these things are important. Some challenges to consider. So as I discussed earlier, when I was speaking with other centers to determine how they had developed these, one of the things, people often said, this is quite difficult sometimes to get the buy-in. And so we've talked a little bit about it, and scheduling is I think really important in the beginning. If it's not scheduled, it's likely not going to happen if it hasn't occurred. People will say they're going to remember, but we're not used to those processes, and so it's going to just get left behind. The naming, that seems so funny, but I think Daniel and I have spoken about it. My experience and his within the Calgary, and I think others within later periods, it sounds so funny, but case review, case conference, whatever it might be, is actually quite challenging. And we really found that we had other processes in Calgary that were called case conferences. We had other processes even specifically within the Child Advocacy Center that were already called case conferences, and they were specifically about medical case conferences. And so that created a lot of confusion in the beginning.
And Carrie, also just to compound that confusion, each organization might also have their own case review process, a formal process where a recent or closed file is selected by that organization for a thorough review. So it caused quite a bit of confusion. It's a triggering term.
Absolutely. Well, and for our staff, exactly like what you're talking about, Daniel, is that review name was triggering for many. And so it was this, oh my goodness, not only is my organization now going to be reviewing my work, but we're going to do this together as a collaborative process. And, so that was really an education about, this isn't a review back on work that has occurred, but this is forward thinking processes. And that really became highlighted many, many times. And so then when we were starting to call them case conferences, that also then became quite concerning in that we already had a medical case conference process. And so it's just, something that Daniel and I, when we were talking about this, thought we really need to share this information. It sounds so minor, but it's actually quite significant in having that buy-in and the understanding of what it is and the understanding of the benefits, and reducing fear of people thinking, I don't want to bring something forward, I'm not going to be reviewed. And we certainly talked about as a center that we would like to review files in a non-threatening way and actually review processes to get better at. But that wasn't always what this was about. This was really about forward thinking, forward moving for families, and how can we do better for these children. So it's just, learn from our experiences about how best to kind of come up with that. And maybe it is something completely different that your center, if you're just developing one, names it something completely different. The structure. So really ensuring that that there is somebody, as Daniel said, facilitating it. If there is a arm's length or kind of a nonprofit entity, it's great if they can be the ones facilitating. Excuse me, a little bit more neutral in who it is. Talking about in the development phase, who's going to take notes? Is everybody taking notes? Does just the facilitator take notes? What are those going to look like? Who are those going to be shared with? And so those are just all really relevant things. I don't think there's any right or wrong answer to it, but it's things that need to be really thought out in the development phase and talked about as a collective so that it is all agreed upon. And then that really helps with the ensuring of the collaboration and having a facilitator that is experienced, that can actually facilitate that in a process that allows voice for all partner organizations to bring something forward and to speak about their concerns or their knowledge of the family or the child or the case that's going on. So having that individual be, and if there isn't a nonprofit entity, it absolutely can be somebody that is assigned and maybe something that is determined, well, we're going to assign it as Children's Services this month, police this month, or RCMP this month, that from the rural areas, whatever it might be. But to know that there is a significant need to allow voice to every individual, and that is very important to include everybody there. So I think it would be good now to go through a couple of examples to really talk about how this can occur. Again, as we've talked about, though, it will look different in different centers and how they're developed and structured. But hopefully these can kind of help to have some ideas about what this could or couldn't look like.
Right. I will start with this first example. And the example that I'm going to describe was of a case review process that proved to be helpful for both the multidisciplinary team members as well as for the child and their family. And this case example is inspired by true events, but may not be specifically accurate in all of the information I'm about to summarize right now. It's just inspired by true events. So the case involves, it's a 12-year-old girl, and she disclosed that she was sexually abused by her mother's partner. And the sexual abuse occurred over a period of 1 year leading up to the disclosure, while the partner was living in the home on a part-time basis. Although the mom had agreed to not allow any contact between her partner and her daughter, she agreed to a safety plan. The mother was quite clear that she did not really believe her daughter's allegation and was hopeful that this allegation would just disappear, that there would be no charges laid, that her daughter would eventually reveal that the allegation was not true and that they could then be a family again. So all of this was brought forward specifically for a case review. And the case review was initiated in order to talk about a development involving this file, that charges had been filed, and there was a need for the team to come together to talk about how this information can be communicated to the child's primary caregiver, her mom. And because it was felt that this would have significant implications for the daughter. This particular development, the mother learning about this, and would really have implications for the way in which the mother is understanding her daughter's needs and supporting her daughter. A really pivotal period for the daughter and her mental health. All of that was discussed in terms of it at this case review. So all of those elements of the case that I just described, police provided a summary of the allegation. child protection, talked about the safety concerns, and how although the mother has committed to the safety plan, her long-term commitment to it is very much in question. Victim services were attempting to be involved. They were meeting with the 12-year-olds, but the mother was minimally engaged in those discussions. And there was a mental health therapist that was working with both the mother and the daughter, working with them regarding the relationship, as well as providing individual trauma treatment to the daughter. At the case review, it was identified that there needed to be a coordinated plan for how the mom would be informed about the filing of charges. And that was the focus of the discussion. And the MDT was able to reach a consensus that it would be best to have not just police, not just the detective, but also the assigned victim support worker providing the mother with the information about this development, the laying of charges. That would be more helpful than just one individual providing that information. It was also identified the importance of having the mental health therapist very much in the loop regarding this development. The therapist would be informed about the mom's response to the filing of charges, and then could include that in the next therapy session, both in terms of hearing from the daughter about how the information about the daughter's experience, what may have happened in the home pertaining to the information about the charges, the daughter's perceptions of the mom's reaction, and then working with mom and daughter regarding how they are now talking about what happened, the charges being filed, and the next steps. It was also identified that there would be a need for increased attention to supporting the mom in her own reaction to this development, and that piece really needed to be emphasized at the outset. This case review discussion and the plan that came from the case review helped the MDT feel as though they had a coordinated plan for how this information was going to roll out. No one MDT member felt as though they were responsible for making sure that everything went smoothly and that everything worked. They were going at this as a collective. It was a coordinated approach. And then there were specific roles that each MDT member would be playing in delivering the information and ensuring that the mom and her daughter were supported with this development. All right, Carrie, I'll pass it on to you.
Wonderful, thank you, Daniel. You know, it is so wonderful to see kind of those benefits and as you say, collective and that collaborative piece. And I mean, that is such a huge piece to remember about, you know, these types of case reviews really just highlights that. So I appreciate that, Daniel, because it is, it's like a weight lifted off, I think, sometimes for frontline staff that we're working together to deal with this. So I just wanted to highlight, and same thing, it was definitely, I won't remember all the details and we won't be speaking about, you know, concrete specifics, but absolutely, this was a file that was brought to case review fairly early on in the development, and a realization that occurred during this really helped us to change processes that were occurring. And so it really highlighted for us how systems could be developed and changed how we operate through this process. So we had a family that was brought to the center, and actually how this case review occurred was our center in Calgary has the Crown often meets children at the center for their interview prior to court. And as I'm sure is very, very similar across Canada, those court dates are often a year or more after any type of incident has occurred. And so we had this young person, I think she was about 10 years old, brought to the center. And I think it was perhaps the constable. So we in Calgary have a few constables that work that are like patrol unit that sometimes operate with a social worker, and they are housed out of our center, which is a little bit different. The process with that is, this person was, this constable was looking out the window and happened to notice the child get out of the car and knew that they were coming up to meet the Crown, but realized that who was dropping them off was the biological father. And the biological father was the accused. And we have a policy at our center, which many do, that we don't have offenders or alleged offenders come into the center. And so he was dropping this child off, and this big kerfuffle occurred, and this understandably. And so a case review occurred. And what we determined from this was that this 10-year-old had been in the care of mom and dad of Asian descent, Chinese family. There had been a physical assault that had occurred, and charges were laid. The father at the time was completely uncooperative, didn't see any concerns about it, unremorseful. I mean, absolutely charges were warranted, and police charged the father. The child was removed, so Children's Services was involved. The child was removed, was in the care of Children's Services for a period of time, I think approximately 6 months. And subsequent to that, and partly this for us in our system was because it was a patrol unit, it didn't stay with Children's Services who were working out of the center. And so there had been very limited, if almost no connection between the Children's Services worker and the constable, who of course they're on to many other files for the next year. And then the Crown sets this meeting up. But during that 6 months that the child was in care and Children's Services was involved, there was extensive family components that were occurring. There was extended family involved. There was a cultural broker involved. There was lots of education that had occurred regarding safety. And it was determined by Children's Services that absolutely this child could go home because it was now a safe environment, and they did not believe there was any risk for future safety. But of course, the judicial system is a little bit slower and hasn't caught up to all of this, and they've still got that process occurring. And so the charges were warranted at the time, and there is still this process that's happening. Through all of this, absolutely there was some help to figure out the process. The Crown was actually invited for this case conference and participated for a short period. They did not come in person. They only participated for kind of the process discussion. They didn't want to be part of the other discussions, and that was understandable. But through all of this, we had determined that our victim support unit or team out of the center didn't deal with these files that the patrols had dealt with. And so we have, in Calgary, there is another unit. There's the victim support that is out of our Child Advocacy Center, but there is also the victim support unit that is out of the police, and they work very collaboratively together. Excuse me, but somehow this one had not been flagged. And so a much greater system was developed for the victim support teams to be talking. Excuse me. And that changed the work that was done through our Child Advocacy Center for a significant amount for the victim support teams and these patrol units. Excuse me, I'll let Daniel take over.
That's a really interesting and effective example, Carrie, of the way in which a case review process can have these helpful, although unintended, implications for the organizations or the broader systems. All of our centers are wanting to ensure that no child falls between the cracks, and that all of the necessary services are being provided. And so the case review that you just summarized highlighted an instance where a service, in particular victim services, was not in the loop, and an opportunity to connect them was then made. But also it helps the systems involved, child protection, policing, and policing at the patrol level, have a new understanding, awareness about the different services that would be important to include, to ensure that the child is supported. It also just highlights how sometimes when you don't have all of the players in the loop, unexpected things can occur, like the child being brought to the center by the alleged offender. Those are really interesting byproducts of having so many players involved in the work.
Well, and it you know, when I look back at this case review process, I don't think at the time it was even really a consideration. There was discussion about the cultural implications. However, subsequent to that case review, which was quite a few years ago, that the Calgary Child, Youth and Advocacy Center has now incorporated a cultural broker that would likely be invited to the case review, and specifically in this scenario. And so would have been able to have more information to be sharing, and perhaps have worked with the family that may make some decisions that would be brought forward to court. Does
sure.
not mean that you know that court wouldn't go forward, but that these discussions may be presented at court. And those are probably more in those patrol level and not the sexual abuse or the severe physical, but the overlapping sometimes of these situations where safety can be obtained. And you know, from a children's services perspective, and certainly many others throughout Canada, that the understanding that children are better at home if they can be safe and supported. But what does that mean then for these other systems, and how do we operate with that?
Yeah. Okay, so we're going to wrap up now, and we're going to open it up to some questions. We just have a few minutes, and you can just put your questions into the chat. Oh, now I see it's coming in this here on the Q&A. So how long do case reviews last? This again might vary from center to center, But I would say that at the centers that I have worked with, the case reviews have been no more than 60 to 90 minutes. And how often do they occur? Again, at a minimum, a case review should be brought forward once per month at a minimum.
Well, and speaking to that kind of that time frame, I think it's for us, when we were developing, really talking about once a month is that minimum, but allowing and strongly encouraging those spontaneous there's something that's come up, and so can we develop one and schedule one within the next couple of days or within a day or whatever it might be.
Certainly for those spontaneous ones that are needed to address an issue that has just recently arisen and is time sensitive. Okay. Any other questions? Here's one. Do case review meetings differ from an intake meeting? So yes, I would assume that an intake meeting may be occurring for every case. The MDT will come together in an informal way, maybe a formal way, to talk about a file as it's coming into the center, so a new file. But case reviews most often occur when the case is already well underway. And this is a formal opportunity for the MDT to have a discussion, a focused discussion about a specific issue that is occurring within the case. And a couple of those issues I think were illustrated in our examples. Those are would be specific reasons that you would bring forward a file.
So the other thing with bringing forward a file for case review, I mean, certainly that was, what the guidelines will highlight kind of some areas that could be there, but it really is quite open, and it's quite open in a lovely way, in that any partner organization could request this. Could say, I'm at the point where I'm needing some support, and perhaps my colleagues who are in a different profession are able to help with that. So that is really helpful there to be able to do that. And it could be complexity. I mean, one of the things that it speaks to in the guidelines is if there's a media sharing that is really important, there's a concern. It could be pulling everybody together. Let's collectively talk about this. So it really could be about the complexity. It could be, sometimes the last partner standing is more that mental health person. Everybody else has kind of dealt with it. Safety has been developed. The police have their process, but things have been going along very well with mental health, and suddenly, oh geez, we've got some new information and we're worried, and so it can be bringing back. But there really are many different areas there, and they can speak to that for sure.
There is 1 minute left, and there is a question here about how was concern for adequacy / sufficiency of the cultural broker addressed.
Sorry, say that again. I don't see that one.
Under the Q&A tab, how is concern for adequacy, sufficiency of the cultural broker addressed?
Well, that probably is a whole nother discussion to be had. But in Calgary, they have a cultural broker that is actually connected to another organization. And definitely there is a significant amount of support that is provided from that agency, and it is an agency that deals with immigrant populations in Calgary. But that could probably be a whole nother discussion.
All right. Thank you all for joining today's presentation. It was a pleasure to talk about this topic. Great to work with you, Carrie, on this.
Oh, you too, Daniel, and thank you very much, everybody, for listening today. And thank you, Pearl.
Have a wonderful rest of your day, everyone.